Patricia Turner, a faculty member in World Arts, Cultures, and Dance and African American Studies. Currently, I serve the campus as Dean and Vice Provost of Undergraduate Education. And on behalf of Chancellor Block and the Senior Administration of UCLA, I want to welcome you all to Athletes, Activism, and Jackie Robinson's Legacy. First, a little housekeeping. Chancellor Block wants you to prevent your cell phones from interfering with anyone else's enjoyment of the panel. After the formal part of our panel presentation ends, which will be about 45 minutes or so, we will take questions and answers. We really don't have much more than 15 minutes for this section of the program, so we ask you to keep your questions brief and to really ask a question of the panelists. After that part of the presentation, there will be a light reception outside on the terrace, and you are invited there, and the panelists will be there for further questions. Today is February 5th, 2019, and I'm sure many momentous things happened 100 years ago in 1919. Of interest to us tonight is the birth of Jack Roosevelt Robinson in Cairo, Georgia, on January 31st, 1919. 5 months later, legislation was signed that led to the formation of UCLA and the admission the following September of 250 freshmen. The histories of UCLA and Jackie Robinson became connected 20 years later in 1939, and they have remained linked ever since. One of the many ways of measuring this is in the names of the buildings on campus. Robinson's biographies are replete with names like Kirchhoff, which is where he worked for a while. Bill Ackerman gave him a summer job in 1940. Tom Bradley, according to one source, was the editor of the Daily Bruin for a year while Robinson was here. He was honored to become friends with Ralph Bunche. And also one of Arthur Ashe's most treasured possessions is the telegram that Jackie Robinson sent to him when he won the US Open. Tonight, we won't be talking about Robinson's athletic accomplishments in the 4 sports he lettered in here at UCLA, or the statistics that garnered him fame as a baseball player, the sport he finally settled on. Rather, this panel will focus on how he and others leveraged that athletic prowess in service to his values and how that legacy has been and is currently being sustained. Allow me to introduce our distinguished moderator. Cari Champion co-authors Coast to Coast edition of ESPN's flagship daily sports news show, SportsCenter. Her weekly podcast with ESPNW, Be Honest with Cari Champion, takes an honest look at the world of sports and pop culture. Previously, she was the host on Sports Nation and First Take. She was an anchor and courtside reporter at the Tennis Channel and has worked across the country covering news, entertainment, and sports stories for all of the major networks. A native Southern California, Champion graduated from UCLA, as did all of the members of our panel, myself excluded.
A clap, no? Can we get it? Yeah, oh, look, I like it. Y'all, come on, you guys are not into it. Okay, I'm sorry, Pat, go ahead.
A native of Southern California, her degree is in American Literatures and Cultures. Please join me in welcoming Cari Champion.
Thank you, Pat. As you can see, I like to have a little fun, so hopefully the friends in the audience who know me get my sense of humor. Thank you so much. Can you please give Pat Turner a round of applause? That was amazing. I appreciate it. So, what I was hoping to do today is very simply just have a conversation about athletes and activism. Everyone on this panel has a relationship in some way with what we'd like to discuss today. So I will ask them all to introduce themselves, because who can describe yourself better than yourself? So Damion, please, you first.
Sure. My name is Damion Thomas. I am the curator of sports for the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C.
It's big time. It's very important. And Pat, again.
Yes, I've already introduced myself. I will say that I take very seriously the legacy of so many African American athletes in UCLA, and my contribution that I make tries to be largely in the classroom in terms of a course that I teach on Arthur Ashe, but that's connected me to so many of the other athletes of significance in UCLA's history.
Pat, thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris Kluwe. I played football here from 2000 to 2004, I think. I played in the NFL for the Vikings from 2005 to 2012. And I stood up for marriage equality while a member of the Vikings, more specifically for LGBTQ rights. And then I was let go from the team and was unable to find a job after that. Very similar to what a quarterback in the NFL is going through right now, which I'm sure you've all seen. But yeah, glad to be here, and it's good to see the campus again.
Got some Chris fans in the house.
I'll go ahead. My name is Kaiya McCullough. I am a current student athlete here. I play for the women's soccer team. I am a junior majoring in political science, and I'm super excited to be here.
I would like for you to tell everyone what you've been doing and why you're here. You started a movement for your team.
Yes, last year I started a movement on my team to kneel in solidarity with Colin Kaepernick, and we continued it this year, and I think it was received really well, and it makes me excited to keep fighting.
All right, that's impressive. So we are coming off of a weekend where we have this Super Bowl, and I think it's so apropos to just start there. The conversation that weekend for people who were attending, I know Damion was there, I was there, there was this divide of people who were happy to be there to celebrate the event, but there were also those who felt as if they couldn't really support it because of what was going on with Colin Kaepernick. And if any of you are on social, I know you've noticed that he was retweeting and tweeting a lot of different influencers who were saying they were in support and they would not be watching the Super Bowl. And I know that there were people who were really conflicted about how they should approach this game, the season, and what it really meant. Can you support one and then support him at the same time? And that was a huge conversation. It's still a conversation in sports today, something that we talk about often in the newsroom at ESPN, because there is something between reporting the news and then saying, what are we putting our personal opinion in it as well? And at the end of the day, I know we do our best to be fair, and it doesn't always come across that way because news is subjective. But Damion, I'll start with you because you are a curator for this. You have gathered all this information over the years, and now you have to look at what's happening. And we talk about athletes and activism. Tell me your opinion on the current state of sports today in relation to athletes and activism, and how you, from your purview, how you see it.
I think, first of all, I was at the Super Bowl and at a number of festivities, and this sort of uneasiness was really pervasive because a lot of the events would take place at places like the Civil Rights and Human Rights Center in Atlanta. And so you kind of have the league there promoting certain messages and ideas, but then you see on the other hand the clear ways that Colin Kaepernick has been blackballed. So you kind of saw it everywhere you went. You kind of saw this uneasiness with what was going on. In terms of what's going on with sports today, I think we are a bit unbalanced. From my perspective, athletes don't tend to lead social movements. What they tend to do best is respond to them and become engaged. And we saw that athletes became engaged after Ferguson, after the death of Mike Brown. And they became engaged and active and helped take this conversation to a national level, such that people who never thought about those issues had to confront them. But what's problematic now is I think the masses of people haven't taken that elevated opportunity to then advance the cause. So in many ways, I think the masses of people, the activists, have let the athletes down.
What do you mean elevated opportunity to advance the cause?
What I mean by that is that, certainly when what was going on in Ferguson, people who are activists could be engaged with it, and people within Black and minority communities were following it. Once the players with the Rams took that stand, then other people who might have tried to avoid it or didn't look at those social media feeds had to confront it. When other athletes began to take a stand and wear the I Can't Breathe shirts and things like that, now it's in front of the entire country. And what I'm saying is that when athletes take a stand, you have to see the public and the leaders take advantage of that new open space that's been created. And I just don't think that's been done.
From my perspective, it's hard to do that when you don't hear a very clear message. We understand why you are kneeling, Colin, but what is the message? Do you want a job in the NFL, or are we done with the NFL? Do you want to get back into the NFL and still be able to do and lead and speak? Because I do feel sometimes the message is gray. Pat, maybe you can help me in terms of just historically speaking. You talk of Jackie Robinson and also of Arthur Ashe. What correlations do you see, if any at all, in terms of where they began and the movement that they had while here?
I think Damion is very accurate in terms of saying that athletes follow on the movements. What it took for Ashe and Robinson to be student athletes, the energy, the age you're at when you're an athlete, you're not out there leading a movement or designing a movement. But Jackie Robinson, let's remember, was court-martialed in the Army for refusing to move to the back of a bus. And that's long before Rosa Parks. I mean, one of the things that an academic has to tell their students is Rosa Parks was far from the first person to refuse to move to the back of the bus. Ashe and Robinson and others get involved as the civil rights movement is unfolding. And people are turning to them because of their visibility and saying, Jackie, join us, be a part of this movement. Arthur got the same messages. Both of them responded in different ways, but they lent their voices, they wrote checks. I mean, it's very interesting that we're having a jazz concert after this. Jackie Robinson would have fundraisers for particular aspects of the civil rights movement, jazz concerts in his backyard as a mechanism of raising money. He was at the March on Washington. So you don't look at them and say, these are the people out there that are the leaders and the instigators, but they responded to the environment and the experiences that they'd had as individuals.
What's the relationship, Chris, between athletes and activism? Is it a personal one, or is it something where you feel an obligation because you have a platform?
I think it depends on the athlete. I mean, obviously my experience as a white guy growing up in Southern California is going to be very different than someone who's a black guy growing up in Mississippi. Like, those are two vastly different, cultural backgrounds. And in terms of the reason why I got involved is because someone asked me to, and I said, well, yeah, I do have a platform. I can help some people out. I should do this because I would want someone to help me out if I was in the position of needing help. And so I think for some athletes, it's because they recognize that they have the platform and they can use it to promote a better world. I think for other athletes, it's because they have been a part of the injustice. They've been on that underdog side, and to them it's more personal, right? Because they have felt it, they have had that experience. I have not had the experience of Colin Kaepernick. I have not had the experience of Jackie Robinson. I never will. I mean, and I'm very privileged just because of the fact that I'm white, and there are a lot of people in this audience who have that same privilege. It's on us to recognize that and understand that we need to work. One of the things you see a lot is people think, oh, well, these minority communities, they should be the ones doing all the work. And can we swear in here? Is that all right?
You are absolutely allowed to swear.
Because well, my kids are here, but that's all right. I think
they may have heard it before, Dad.
So, but frankly, that's bullshit. We can't push all the work of changing things onto the communities that are being adversely affected, the communities that are being held down.
Chris, say it again. I want to yell amen because I don't need a lesson on racial inequality. I'm very well aware of it. I experience it daily. And so we've been in this in terms of people that I know and what they want to do. It's to go to these other communities. We can have all the discussions, at the church that honored MLK, but we need to go to other communities that don't know what it is and explain it to them. But everyone is not as receptive. So talk to me about how you feel that you're able to recognize, for lack of a better term, white privilege and be okay with sharing that message and saying we should do more with our influence and what we know.
Well, for me personally, it's because of my perspective as an athlete. I'm a very selfish person. I want to know that when I beat you at your best, right? Like, if I beat you in a race, it wasn't because you had a 100-pound weight tied to your leg. Like, we were both running flat out and I was just faster that day. If I'm going up against someone who hasn't had the same advantages that I've had, that hasn't lived in the same world that I've had, how do I know that I beat them at their best? Like, they're having to deal with stresses and problems that I have not had to deal with. So have they reached their full potential? I don't know. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. But yeah, for me, that's personally, I am fortunate enough to have had a very privileged life, and I don't think it's out of the realm of the ordinary to ask that everyone has access to those same advantages. Like, it really isn't that much to ask for, that everyone gets an equal chance to thrive based on their own merits. And a lot of people like to think we're in that society, but we really aren't. So we need to keep pushing for that society where everyone does have those same chances to thrive.
Well, amen to Chris Kluwe, shall we? I mean, it's okay to clap. So Kaiya, talk to me about your experience. It's interesting, and I like that we have all these different perspectives on the panel because, we are not clearly in college anymore. And you can talk to us about the perspective, because I feel like in college there is a much more radical perspective in the sense that there is this hope, this drive, this untainted spirit, if you will, meaning that you want to go hard and you want everyone to know how you feel. Tell me about your purpose in terms of your movement and deciding to kneel and how it was received on campus and from others elsewhere.
Yeah, so for me, I remember my specific instance of call to action I saw on Twitter, because us millennials are very active on Twitter, another video of an unarmed black man being shot, and I just remember breaking down into tears. And it was around the time that a lot of controversy around Colin Kaepernick was kind of sparking up again, and I remember texting my coach and just being like, hey, I have something really important to discuss with you. It's in regards to me possibly kneeling. And it was a really scary moment for me because I wasn't really sure how it would be perceived by my team or by my coaches. Obviously, speaking up about things that matter to you is kind of scary because you don't know how people are going to receive it. But I was blessed and thankful enough that my team and my coaches had a really candid, open discussion about what was going on, and they listened to me and they tried to empathize with me. And for me, that's what it's all about. It's empathy. You see all these stories and it's hard to not be moved, and it's hard to not feel sadness for people who are going through things that you couldn't possibly imagine. I mean, I grew up really privileged too. I have a white mother and a black father, and so in regards to colorism and stuff, I've experienced privilege, and I grew up in a wealthy area, so I've experienced privilege in that way too. And I think for me, it was more of I have a platform, so I need to use it. I have to use it. And I think we very much do, as young people, have kind of this hope that everything will be okay one day. And it hasn't changed for me yet, so that's exciting.
I hope it doesn't. Give it to us. Give it to me specifically. I don't want to speak to them. Give it to me.
Yeah, no, it hasn't changed yet. So I'm excited to keep kneeling. Next season, our season's over, but next fall, I hope to keep doing it and just standing up for things that I believe in.
Congratulations to you. That's a very bold movement. No, seriously. Consider the fact, I think that so many athletes, professional athletes who get paid, I mean, it's a really scary thing for them to kneel. They feel some type of way and they want to do something, but they've been told without being told that they can't. Or sometimes they've been straight out told, no, you're not allowed to do that. So kudos to your coach for allowing that open dialogue and you being very, very free and willing to do that. Damion, I have to ask you this because I really get upset when I hear that sports and politics don't mix. I think that's the biggest lie that's ever been told. And I feel like since the beginning of time, that's how it's been, and it will always be that way. And the relationship between politics and sports is so prevalent and so obvious, and so there is a favoritism there that we overlook often and we don't pay attention to. So Damion, when you think of, and you're at the museum, you're at the Smithsonian, you think of the relationships between sports and politics. Take us back to the beginning where you first saw that relationship and how maybe it's grown or it's had its issues, or perhaps how it's perceived by those in the world who aren't necessarily aware of it.
I think what's interesting about sports is that often people don't think about sports as containing ideological content. People think about sports as being something that's about fun and games or about enjoyment. But that actually makes it a very important vehicle to transmit messages, because people aren't often aware of the messaging that's taking place.
The messaging like?
For example, one of the things that's interesting about the United States is that sports are such an integral part to our educational system. And that's not true in most places around the world. And that's because we believe in something called the American sports myth. And this is the idea that sports teaches values, it teaches discipline, teaches character, and we attribute all of this kind of character development, all of this socializing to sports. So from the very beginning, sports have been used to do social work. For example, if you think about the creation of basketball, created by Dr. James A. Naismith for the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, in 1991. Largely because men and boys stopped going to church and at the numbers that they had been going. And so basketball becomes a vehicle to teach young men and boys at that point Christian middle-class values. So from very early on, basketball is tied to these Christian ideas of chastity, temperance, thrift, and things of that nature. So from very early on, basketball has been used as a socializing tool. And so from there, politics have always been involved in sports and class identity. Even if you go back and think about the creation of professional sports. If you're familiar with the history of football, starts at the Yales and University of Chicago's and Michigan. And it's this sort of idea of the amateur athlete. But what happens when sports becomes professional? It starts at the working class. You think about the Green Bay Packers, who work at a packing plant, or the Pittsburgh Steelers, who work at a steel mill, these working class jobs. And so then professional sports becomes demonized because money is involved and you have this class dynamic and this idea that these working class people are trying to mimic this higher order. Sure. And so from the very early on, sports are tied to notions of class, of gender, who competes, and even race.
And then that translates to politics.
Yes.
Can I point something out real quick there? Because it always drives me nuts when I see people do this. When a player gets a new contract or is negotiating for a new contract, fans will always be upset at the player for wanting to get more money. They will never be upset at the owner, who is a billionaire who owns the team.
Go ahead and say it again, Chris.
That is politics in sports, okay?
It's so annoying.
There's a reason that message is the one that's always out there.
Okay, so Pat, I have to ask you, because you're shaking your head as Damion's talking and you're in agreement. I really, and you can't get in their heads, but I really want you to break down, and from what I've been told, because I used to work at the Tennis Channel, Billie Jean King talks very highly of Arthur Ashe and what his movement was, but he was very specific in what he wanted to do. And she shares these stories of how at the time when she was going for women's privileges, he's like, I can't do it right now because I have to focus on what we're doing as African Americans and making sure there's equality there. He was like, I'd love to join forces with you, but we need a moment to focus on this race issue that is really prevalent as opposed to dealing with the gender issue at this moment. Talk to me about what you perceive Arthur Ashe's legacy to be, and what he was trying to do and how it relates to where we are today with athletes and activism.
So, and Damion can jump in too, because Damion's written a lot about Ashe, so I'm not the only Ashe person on the panel. The Arthur Ashe was very deliberate in what he wanted to accomplish. He always saw the education that he was getting at UCLA as the primary reason for being here. And tennis, even then, a full scholarship wasn't what a full scholarship is now. So he was in ROTC and other things. So as I said earlier, he was involved with the civil rights movement. There's a famous meeting at Walt Hazzard's house in Atlanta that Jaleesa Hazzard's talked to my students about, where Jesse Jackson brought an entourage of people to try to convince Arthur Ashe to be more visible and outspoken in the movement. And Ashe said, I'm involved, but I will do it my way, and I will do it on my terms, and I'm not you, I'm not Harry Edwards, I have my approach to doing things. When you look back at where he gave money, where he gave his time, where he gave scholarships, he was extraordinarily involved all along the way. For him personally, the anti-apartheid movement was where he really begins to get quite visible, because he couldn't get a visa to play tennis in South Africa. And
tennis is one of the most international sports, so you need it.
If you're going to be a tennis, if you're going to be prominent in the tennis world, you can't take one of the major cities in the world and just not play there. And so it took him several years of activism in order to just get a visa. And he insisted when he got there that he would not play in front of a segregated audience. And they manipulated that, but he came up front and personal with the degree of poverty and the profound racism of the apartheid movement. And that becomes one of the first real causes that he is visible around, but not the last. Now, we're playing with what's the definition of activism? Is activism kneeling before a game? Is activism wearing a T-shirt? And one of the things I think that he did that's so significant is he wanted to teach a course on African Americans and athletics, and he couldn't find good sources. He couldn't find books and articles. So he decided, out of his own money, to do all of this research, and he published a 3-volume book called Hard Road to Glory, which still stands, Damion, don't you think, as a key resource for anyone teaching about sports and African Americans. Then, of course, when he contracted AIDS, that became another one of the causes that he was involved in.
You said two things that I think is interesting. What is the definition of activism? I think that we are learning today more and more that everyone will be an activist in their own way, and there is no right way to do it. There is no, if you're moved and led by it. Chris, do you believe, and I'll stay in the NFL, but athletes in general, do you believe there will be a time in which, and I say this, I feel as if the NFL is so far behind the NBA. I feel as if the NBA allows their players to be much more free in what they say, and if the owners could literally take a lesson, and Damion can tell me if he disagrees or not, but if they could take a lesson from them, I feel as if the players have much more of a platform where they can say and do what they want, and to the point that it doesn't divide them from perhaps getting another contract or being blackballed. Is there a time in which you can see the NFL embracing the owners, embracing the athletes, having their own platform to be activists in whichever way they choose?
Yeah, we just need to break out the guillotines. I mean, like that. The NFL is, it has the weakest players union of any of the major sports. And to all of you out there, join a union. Okay, unions are very, very important. Like, no joke. I mean, a lot of the problem, like when you bring up, what is activism? Activism is those who do not have power who are being oppressed by those with power, and they're trying to change that dynamic. Right now, in our country and pretty much the entire world, economic inequality is just off the charts. Like it is at levels past what it was during the Great Depression. Like we are headed. I was a poli-sci history major, so I got to study all this stuff. We're headed for some pretty interesting times in the Chinese proverb sense of the word. But no, like seriously, in order for the NFL to change, they have to view athletes speaking out on social issues as more profitable to their bottom line than keeping those athletes silent. And that's not going to change unless the people who put money in the owners' pockets want that to change. So if the fans want that to change, it will change. But if the fans want the status quo, we're going to get the status quo.
I think in terms of the NFL, it's important to remember that the NFL is very socially engaged. The point is that the NFL social engagement largely comes from top down. If you think about domestic violence, the NFL is perhaps one of the organizations that's done more to put a spotlight on domestic violence than any other in the last couple of years.
But why is that?
Very involved.
Is that
I'm not
PR?
sure. I'm not sure why that is.
I'm going to take you to Ray Rice. I'm going to challenge you on that.
Ray Rice.
Yeah.
And okay, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that I believe they became more involved because of Ray Rice. You remember their initial response. They suspended him for a few games and it wasn't an issue. And then it became an issue because of the public backlash. I believe they pick and choose when they decide whether or not they want to be publicly and socially involved and how they want to be involved. I don't believe there's any truth to it in terms of, I think it's what looks right.
Well, that's a good point. But we also have to remember, when Ray Rice was originally given a 2-game suspension, that was the longest suspension that had ever been given to anyone in any league around the issue of domestic violence. Also, when you think about the league and its involvement in domestic violence, what other spaces are people losing their jobs because of their involvement in domestic violence?
No other spaces.
I think it's very important that we acknowledge that the NFL has been socially engaged. If you think about that issue, if you think about breast cancer, the NFL has been engaged in that. If you think about the troops and things like that. Now, it might be that the NFL has an agenda, and there are reasons why they're doing that. But for me, the point that I'm making is that the social engagement is top down in the NFL.
Which means what?
Which means that it comes from the league. The league is sort of picking the social issues that they want to be engaged in. One of the differences with the NBA is that social engagement moves from the bottom up. And I think that's where you see the players empowered to sort of define what are the key issues that they want to be involved in, and the league getting behind them and supporting them. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that difference.
So actually, if I can jump in, I think a way to look at that is that when the players are engaged, and tell me if you agree or not, when the players are engaged in an issue, as in the NBA, stuff actually happens, right? Like there actually is social activism. There is change being put forth. When the engagement is coming from the top down, as in the NFL, as Cari's saying, it's more a PR stunt. It's more like for the breast cancer initiative, for example, 95% of the money went towards the marketing, and it didn't go towards breast cancer. Only 5% of the funds raised actually went towards breast cancer. Same with domestic violence. It was like, oh crap, people are getting really upset about this. We need to put this fire out. Let's make it look like we care about domestic violence. Their little initiative that they put together has done nothing in terms of substance on domestic violence. So I would say, yes, you're absolutely right in terms of, yeah, it's coming from top down. And I would say that's actually a negative, because it doesn't mean that things are changing. Like there is no incentive for them to actually work for change. It's just, let's put out the fires. Would you agree?
I definitely agree with that.
I'm not going to say anything. I don't want to get fired. Yeah. We have a segment called Don't Get Fired today, so I don't want to get fired.
No, ESPN doesn't have a history of...
Don't get fired today, Cari. I am saying you are correct. They are socially involved, but as you said, Chris, they pick and choose. And so if there's no, and you said this best earlier, Kaiya, if there's no empathy, if you don't see the humanity in this, then what are we doing? Because everyone that we're honoring, we're here because Jackie, there was empathy, the humanity, he was living it. Same with Arthur Ashe. There was an empathy there where you felt it and it hurt and you had to do something and you were moved to be socially engaged. Kaiya, you were moved to be socially engaged because you saw a black man being shot on Twitter and that moved you so much that you had to go and talk to your coach. If you look at what we're doing in the professional leagues, and you've said to me that you want to go pro, what would you take that same stance then? Would you have, I don't know if it's intestinal fortitude, would you have the same ideas that you have now on the college level once you turn pro?
Absolutely. I think my convictions are very strong, and I am 100% sure that they would translate with me. The differences is that the platform that I have here at such like an open, loving, just accepting school, quite frankly, I'm not quite sure how it would translate going forward into a professional league, especially with the NWSL, which is the professional league for women's soccer. I know one of my favorite soccer heroes is Megan Rapinoe, and she was one of the first people to start kneeling in solidarity with Colin Kaepernick, and she actually had to stop doing it in order to play for the U.S. because they were so angered by it, and it looked bad on their public image. So will my conviction be there? Yeah, it will, 100%. Will I be able to? I sure hope so, because if I'm not, then I think that's when I need to start evaluating my choices and what I want to do. Can I support a league that can't support me and what I believe in? I don't know.
I have to ask you this question. This is for everyone. I often say this, and I said this on a show recently, and you mentioned breast cancer and the NFL's involvement. If Colin Kaepernick had been kneeling for breast cancer, would there be an issue?
No.
I know, I'm serious. Like if he was like, I'm gonna kneel for breast cancer because someone that I love has breast cancer, would he be where he is today? And how does that make you feel, knowing that he's fighting for equal rights? And that's why he's kneeling, but breast cancer would be socially acceptable, not equal rights.
Well, again, that gets back to the whole idea of politics and sports. You cannot separate the two. And so what is deemed socially acceptable to demonstrate for is completely tied up in what politics are and what is considered socially acceptable. So as you just pointed out, kneeling for breast cancer, I don't think anyone would have had a problem with it. Being familiar with the NFL, there would have been no problem with that. Because he is pointing out the ugly history of racism in the United States that is still going on to this very day, a lot of NFL fans don't want to have to confront that. They don't want to have to deal with the fact that racism isn't just putting on a white sheet or a MAGA hat. It's the structural endemic problems that are baked into our very society that we have to fix. And it's hard work to fix those. And it requires examining your privilege and understanding where you fit into that and how you can change it. So I think that's, again, politics and sports they're intertwined all the way.
You want to add, Damion or Pat?
I mean, I agree. It's interesting to me that kneeling itself has been interpreted as a sign of disrespect. I can
Let's
think
talk
of
about
other,
that.
I can think of other things that you can do that are genuinely disrespectful, but quietly getting on a knee, not vocalizing anything, that's interpreted as disrespectful.
Why is that though, Pat, in your opinion?
I leave that to the folks who do the contemporary stuff. I'm the historian.
It wouldn't matter what he did.
Yeah.
It wouldn't matter what the gesture was. The fact that this was the issue he's bringing attention to, it would not have mattered what he did.
And it's what he looks like. You know, you can't divorce the image. I've read, comparisons of his hairstyle to Angela Davis. It's the look of him. It's people perceiving a defiance in what is what could argue one of the most submissive actual physical positions that you can assume.
When you're on the field, Chris, and a player gets injured, what do?
You take a knee. When you're in a huddle, you take a knee. When your coach is talking to you, you take a knee. It's what you do on a football field. When you are winning the game, you take a knee. It's victory formation. Everyone loves victory formation.
In theory, it doesn't interfere with anyone else's ability to observe the flag, to sing the anthem. You're not doing anything that interferes. It was like what I said at the beginning. Don't do anything with your cell phone that will interfere with somebody else's appreciation for this function. When you're kneeling, you're not doing anything. And we can all think of other things you could do that would be disruptive, that would actually interfere. So I actually think that if you have, as Kaepernick does, a desire to use that platform to say, this is what's happening to black men in driving while black and so forth. This is my way of adding to other things that I do, because it's not the only thing that he does. He has a foundation, he's got clout behind that. That is anathema to people, is particularly disturbing.
Damion, how do you, being the curator of sports, how will this moment, and so far, are you guys gathering information currently in terms of what's happening in the NFL and the NBA? Or how will it, because I haven't been in the museum, I need to go. How will it, yeah, I know. How will it be preserved?
Well, it's still an ongoing story. And so we're still watching to see what happens. Recently, someone said to me that Colin Kaepernick is the Rosa Parks of his generation. And to them, I said, we don't know. It depends on what happens after this. If this leads to substantial change in society, then maybe we see him that way. If nothing changes, then do we forget Colin Kaepernick in 10 years? And so it's something that you're still gonna have to pay attention to. I think certainly it's become an iconic moment, and we've collected items from Colin Kaepernick. What
kind of items?
We collected a jersey, some cleats. He was on the cover of Time magazine. We have a copy of that. So we've started an initial collection of things. Derrick Rose was the first to wear the I Can't Breathe shirt. We have that shirt. Andrew Hawkins wore a shirt which said "Justice for Tamir Rice and John Crawford, the two men who were killed in Ohio," with a young boy and the man who was killed in Ohio. So we've collected items around this particular moment, but we still need to see how it plays out before we can really figure out how we can best interpret these items.
Best interpret, that's good. Okay, guess what, guys? I've got a few minutes and we're gonna open it up to the audience for a couple of quick questions. But before we go, I like to end on something hopeful, and just hopeful. So I'll start with you, Kaiya. You talk about athletes and activism. What would you like to see as we celebrate, remember, this 100th birthday of Jackie Robinson?
I think it's been said before, there's definitely a stigma behind athletes being political beings, and I'd like to see, specifically across all sports, that the association between athletes and activism is more accepted, and that athletes aren't necessarily just regarded for their athleticism. Like, that we can begin to see them as whole people, as intellectuals, as people with emotions and empathy and a passion for things, and not just hold them on this impossible pedestal of they can't mess up or they can't do anything that doesn't involve what they stand for. I don't know. I hope that the platform expands and that people are able to accept the role of athletes moving more towards standing up for what they believe in.
Yeah, kind of building off that, just understanding that athletes, we're not just athletes, we're people. We go to school, we go home, we live in the same world as everyone else. We don't exist in this little separate bubble and then we get trotted out on the field. We're people, like everyone else. And so if we see something happening and we want to say something about it, It's the same as if you're at work or at school or with your family and you want to say something about it. It's just our society, for whatever reason, puts us on this stage and gives us this microphone, so our words are going to be amplified. And so, if there are any other athletes out there, you do have a platform. You can use it to promote change in the world. And then for everyone else, if you do see an athlete say something that you agree with, you think that that's a cause worth fighting for, go fight for that cause. Like, it doesn't even have to be huge sweeping gestures. Just get involved locally. Like, go to your local school board meeting. There's so much stuff that happens at your local school board meeting that affects your community in so many ways. And generally the people showing up are old, cranky people who have way too much time on their hands, and they're pretty regressive. So go to your local school board meetings, get involved in your local community, just find ways that you can help out. And it doesn't have to be a big gesture. Enough small gestures are what actually changes things. We like to look at it through this historical lens of, here was this one person and then the world changed. It's like, no, that's not what happened. It was all these people and then the world changed. So go be one of those people.
Be one of those people.
And I want all of this prominent. I want athletes in the history and culture books on an even floor with all of the politicians and others in history. There are students who take my class on Arthur Ashe who think that he was the first doctor at UCLA because the health center was named after him. There are students who don't know who Arthur Ashe was, who Jackie Robinson is. Forget Luval, Tom Bradley, Ralph Bunche, and others, all of whom were student athletes here. And so there are so many places and so many ways in which that history can and should inform what this generation of activists can do. Why should they make the same mistakes that might have been made before? There's much that they can learn, so I've become a real advocate for getting that central.
Learn your history.
Speaking of history, in 1997, I was working on my PhD here at UCLA, and Rachel Robinson, Jackie Robinson's wife, came to campus. And this was an important year because this was the 50th anniversary of Jackie Robinson integrating Major League Baseball. And she said that she was working with this writer, and they were there premiering the book, this guy Arnold Rampersad, on a biography of Jackie Robinson, because she was unhappy with the way that sports writers and historians had written about her husband. And so after this meeting, I went and read this book. And one of the things that stood out to me was that when Jackie Robinson was ready to retire after his 10 years in the major leagues, he was one of the most hated men in baseball, largely because people wanted him to be a symbol. People wanted to look at Jackie Robinson and say, look at what we did. We integrated baseball. Look at the progress that we've made. And Jackie Robinson always said, well, we still haven't done enough. When Jackie Robinson retired, there were still 3 or 4 teams in Major League Baseball that had not integrated. He pushed for more managers. He pushed for people in the front office. And by the time he retired, he was seen as being ungrateful. He was seen as being somebody who was combative. He was seen as somebody who would not allow baseball and society to celebrate all of this progress. And she wanted to make sure that people understood this story, that even though Jackie Robinson did all these amazing things, there was a cost that came with it. And I think that's something that athletes also have to think about, the cost and whether they're willing to pay it. And thankfully, we have people like LeBron James and other athletes, Colin Kaepernick, who are sort of following in that legacy. And that's why I'm hopeful.
That's great. That is a great message to end on. Again, we are going to open it up for a couple of questions from my understanding, and there is a microphone, I believe, floating around. I can't see because I don't have on my contacts, so whoever has said microphone, you want to start with a question in the audience? Great, over there. Hello.
Hi, my question is, how do you respond to, as Chris called him, the regressive guy, who says, I don't want politics in sports. I want sports to be my escape from politics to the real world.
Yeah, I hear that often. How do you, and I don't know if you guys heard him, how do you respond to people who say, I want sports to be my escape from the real world? I do not want sports and politics.
Why do they do the Pledge of Allegiance then?
I've asked that often.
You say to that person, you say, if you're saying that, then what you're saying is you're content with the status quo. You're content with the politics that already exist. And your sports are still full of politics. They're just politics that don't personally affect you in a negative way. That's why you think sports can be free of politics. However, for a lot of other people, sports and politics, very intertwined because it does affect them in a negative way. And so maybe take the blinders off, do some research, look at how communities are affected by what goes on, by the policies implemented by the people in charge of sports. I mean, one thing that really stood out to me about the Super Bowl was the NFL did its big, social justice commercial, immediate cut to Tom Brady on the field. Guy with a MAGA hat in his locker. Both owners of the NFL teams in the Super Bowl donated to Trump, okay? Politics and sports, always intertwined. So say to that person, just because you're not negatively affected by the current politics, it doesn't mean that other people aren't.
I think Chris, yeah.
Sorry, I get a little fired up.
No, it's okay. Only reason why I say I can relate to that is because there is, especially at the company I work for, there's a big push in, I just want to sit and watch the game. I want to have a beer. I don't want to hear about what the problems are. And I believe what he's saying is that if I just want to sit in front of the TV, I just don't want to be socially responsible. How do you make someone feel, because I don't think you can, how do you make someone feel socially responsible? You can't make someone be engaged if they don't want to, because they want to watch the game in the way that they watch the game, or enjoy the sport in the way that they enjoy the sport.
Well, I mean, you can't force people to unionize either, even though it's better for them. It creates a better world for them. You can't force people to act in their own best interests. Like, you can explain it to them as best you can, but eventually they got to take that step.
I think part of the issue is that people come to social awareness in different ways. And I think someone could not want to engage it in the sports world, but maybe engage it through their church or engage it through some other entity. And so, whereas for me, sports is the vehicle through which I understand society, I think it's also appropriate that some people might not want sports to serve that function in that role for them.
And that's their choice. This is a free country. You got one other, or is it? No, it's not. We have one other question over here. Gentleman in the front row.
I can yell.
Oh, okay.
Google says that the NFL has a net worth of $70 billion. Many of the players come out of California public schools, specifically the Los Angeles School District, which has a poverty rate of 80%. Where's the reciprocity? And where are activists asking this question with a viable solution?
Where are the activists? I mean, the question you're asking is, why aren't more people upset about billionaires? Which I would love to know the answer to that. Because frankly, as I said before, we are in a time of historic economic inequality. And when you look at NFL teams raising billions of dollars worth of public funds to build stadiums, while firefighters are getting fired, teachers are getting fired, they're busting unions in the public sector, it doesn't end well. Like, historically, we're not on a good track. So the question that you brought up, where's the reciprocity, that's something we all have to ask ourselves. It can't just be athletes. It has to be everyone saying, why does so few people control so much wealth? Why do these people have access to all these resources and they're not giving it back to others who need it?
Why is that, Chris?
Because they're selfish dicks.
Okay, there's the answer.
Yeah.
Guys, that was very eloquently put. We got another question out there?
I want to respond to that, because if you think about the politicians in terms of where they're putting money, one of the things that some scholars have been able to demonstrate is that when money to schools get cut, Politicians don't pay a political price, but they pay a political price when sports teams leave cities.
Interesting.
Politicians, you look at it, mayors where the team leaves usually lose re-election.
Because our priorities are so backwards. Because we care more about the things that we really care about, which is when you're back, I just want to enjoy my sports. I don't want to think about it to be socially aware. Let me get one more question in here. Yeah, over here in the corner.
Hi. Thank you for coming. Appreciate you spending your time here. So my question is, what would your advice be for those attempting to shed more light on and take actions in the inequalities that still exist in sports, whose foundation was built on this level of exclusion and exclusivity and privilege? For example, golf. So golf and tennis don't necessarily have the advocates like the NBA does in LeBron James and Chris Paul. So what would your advice be in shedding more light on that?
Pat?
I was okay until you threw in the specific examples of golf and tennis. I mean, I'm going to sound like what I am. I'm a dean and a vice provost and a faculty member. I'm a real believer in getting the degree, right? Get the college degree for athletes. I abhor one and done. I think that what Arthur Ashe had going for him and Kareem and many of his contemporaries was the goal was to get the degree. And that takes the pressure off actually the earning that you have to do as an athlete because you've got an education that will enable you to get a career outside. But I don't think that we're well served with the entirety of these people's being in the sport, and without the balance of an education that allows you, even if you're successful. In most sports, you retire at fairly young ages, and you've still got your whole life ahead of you to support yourself and so forth. So I'm going to sound like what I am. I'm a dean.
And there's nothing wrong with that, Pat. You are a dean of education. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, have you learned something today? At least one thing? One thing? I learned a lot. My guy Damion set me up. Pat, Chris, Kaiya, you guys are amazing. Please continue in your own efforts to do what you do, which is educate. And if that is activism for you in your own way, maybe someone here in the audience has been, implored to be an activist in their own way. Again, you don't have to be on the front of the picket lines, as he said. Go to the school board meeting and get cranky with those cranky people. But we are having a reception afterwards. You can chat with them some more if they're going to stick around. And again, thank you so much for showing up tonight and celebrating Jackie Robinson with us. I appreciate it. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Give it up for this panel. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.